What if one decision changed the entire world? What if a single border crossing in 2022 had simply never happened? No war, no trenches, no drone attacks, no sanctions, no global energy crisis, no daily headlines from a continent at war. Imagine waking up in a world where Russia never invaded Ukraine in 2022, where the maps stayed the same. Would inflation still explode? Would NATO still expand? Would Europe still fear war on its eastern frontier? Would millions of Ukrainians still live normal lives, going to school, raising children, planning futures? And here's the terrifying part. A single choice by one man may have completely rewritten the future of the planet, economies, alliances, even the climate. Because the Ukraine war didn't just change Europe. It changed economies, technology, food prices, military strategy, and global alliances, even the future of China and Taiwan. So tonight, we enter the alternate timeline where Russia never crossed the border. February 24th, 2022. The day a continent woke up to a war it had hoped was impossible. In our timeline, Russian missiles slammed into Ukrainian cities before sunrise. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, all hit within hours. But in this alternate history, the invasion never happens. The same dawn breaks over the same city, without explosions. Russian troops stay massed near the border. Tensions remain dangerously high. The world watches and panics for weeks on end. And then suddenly, Putin announces a strategic de-escalation. Forces pull back. Diplomats fly in. The crisis appears to dissolve. No tanks roll into Kyiv. The world breathes again. But beneath the surface, history begins changing in ways nobody expects. In reality, Russia expected a quick victory. The plan was 3 days to Kyiv. The plan failed catastrophically within weeks. Instead, the invasion became one of the most economically devastating geopolitical mistakes of the century for Russia itself. But in this alternate timeline, Putin avoids the gamble entirely. The folder stays closed. The order is never given. Russia keeps trading freely with Europe. Its banks remain connected to global markets. The financial isolation never happens. Western companies never flee Moscow. McDonald's, IKEA, Apple, BMW all stay. The brand exodus of 2022 doesn't occur. Russian oil and gas continue flowing normally into Europe. Pipelines run at full capacity. Energy markets stay calibrated. And that changes everything. Because before the war, Europe depended heavily on Russian energy, far more than most realized. Germany especially built much of its industrial power around cheap Russian gas. Take that away, and German manufacturing wobbles. Without the invasion, Europe avoids the massive energy shock. Electricity prices rise slowly, not violently. Inflation becomes far less severe. Manufacturing across Europe stays more stable. Factories don't shutter. Supply chains hold. The continent's industrial heart keeps beating. In our world, ordinary people suddenly paid more for food, gas, electricity, rent. Here, the economic pain is dramatically reduced. And suddenly, Western unity starts looking weaker. Without war, there's far less urgency to isolate Russia or coordinate sanctions. One of the biggest consequences of the real invasion was NATO becoming stronger. The alliance found new purpose almost overnight. Countries that once stayed safely neutral suddenly became terrified. The old assumptions about European security collapsed in days. Most importantly, Finland and Sweden moved decisively toward NATO membership. After decades of neutrality, both joined the alliance. That was historic. Finland shares a massive 800-mile border with Russia, the longest of any NATO member state today. For decades, Finland avoided joining NATO specifically to prevent provoking Moscow. Neutrality was treated as the country's defining doctrine. But after the invasion, everything changed. Public opinion in both countries shifted 70% in favor of NATO membership. Now imagine the alternate timeline. No invasion means Finland likely stays militarily neutral for many more years, perhaps indefinitely. Sweden faces less pressure to join NATO. The 200-year tradition of Swedish non-alignment continues uninterrupted, defending its own logic. NATO expansion slows dramatically. The alliance does not have its great catalyzing moment. The map of European security stays static. Ironically, by trying to weaken NATO, Russia actually made it bigger and more united than at any point since the Cold War. But without the war, that momentum disappears entirely. Europe's strategic mood returns to where it was in late 2021. Inside Europe, many countries quietly return to business as usual with Moscow. Some leaders even push for warmer ties again. Now comes the hardest question. What happens to Ukraine in the timeline where the invasion never came? In our world, millions were displaced. 8 million refugees fled westward, the largest European refugee crisis since the Second World War. Entire cities were destroyed. Mariupol, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, families separated, hundreds of thousands killed or wounded across both sides. But in this alternate timeline, Ukraine survives physically intact. Every city, every village, every road remains exactly as it was. Kiev remains peaceful. Mariupol never becomes a battlefield. The Sea of Azov coast stays a holiday destination, not a graveyard. Children continue going to school normally. Millions never become refugees. Families stay together. Life simply goes on, undramatic. At first glance, this sounds like the obviously better future. And for ordinary civilians, it absolutely, unambiguously is. But geopolitically, things become complicated. Because before the invasion, Ukraine was stuck in a dangerous gray zone between blocks. Not fully protected by NATO, constantly pressured by Russia, economically vulnerable to outside shocks, politically fragile from within. Without invasion, Ukraine may continue struggling with corruption, political instability, slow military modernization, and uncertainty about joining Europe. Ironically, the war accelerated Ukraine's integration with the West. Massive military aid, economic support, EU candidate status, European sympathy. Without invasion, Ukraine may slowly drift in uncertainty for years, still independent, still tense, still trapped between East and West. Now zoom out. Because the invasion didn't just affect Europe, it rippled across every continent and into every economy. It hit the entire global economy. Oil prices surged past $120. Food prices exploded almost overnight. Supply chains worsened dramatically, just as the world was finally recovering from the pandemic disruptions of 2020. Russia and Ukraine were major exporters of wheat, fertilizer, oil, and natural gas, the four pillars of modern food and energy. The war disrupted all of it at once. Black Sea grain shipments halted. Fertilizer prices doubled. Energy markets convulsed. Countries in Africa and the Middle East faced rising food insecurity. Bread prices rose in Cairo, Tunis, Beirut, and beyond. Fuel became more expensive globally. Central banks aggressively raised interest rates to fight inflation across every developed economy. Now imagine none of that happens. Inflation still exists after the pandemic, but it rises far more slowly, peaks lower. Gas prices stay lower. Food shocks become smaller. Global recession fears weaken substantially. Markets find footing earlier. And here's the huge one. America may raise interest rates much less aggressively than it did in 2022 and 3, which could completely alter housing markets tech layoffs, startup collapses, and stock market volatility through the entire mid-decade. In this timeline, the economic turbulence of the early 2020s becomes less severe, not because the world is stable, but because one giant accelerant never ignites. But the country watching most carefully was China. Beijing studied every detail, every decision, every reaction in real time. The Ukraine war became a real-world experiment, a laboratory for what happens when a nuclear power invades its neighbor today. China observed Western sanctions, military resistance, global reactions, economic consequences. It built dossiers on every category of response, especially regarding Taiwan. The lessons from Kyiv would translate directly to any future scenario across the Taiwan Strait. In our world, Russia's invasion likely made China more cautious. The West responded harder and faster than Beijing expected. Because the West responded harder than many expected. NATO unified. Sanctions came swiftly. Weapons aid flowed at unprecedented scale. But in the alternate timeline, China sees something completely different. The Western reaction never happens because the trigger never fires. It sees hesitation, division, weak Western coordination, delayed responses, disagreements over scale. Public attention spans worn thin, and that may actually increase the risk of future aggression elsewhere. The lesson of weakness invites the next test, because if Russia never invades, the world never rehearses its response. There's no muscle memory built, no precedents set, no sanctions blueprint, no weapons coordination, no lessons from drone warfare. Every future crisis starts from a cold, institutional standstill. Future conflicts could become even more dangerous. The world appears calmer, but may secretly become far less prepared for what comes. The Ukraine war transformed warfare itself. Doctrine that had been theoretical since the 1940s became overnight tactical reality. Drones became terrifyingly effective. A $200 quadcopter could destroy a $5 million tank and did so daily. Cheap technology began destroying billion-dollar equipment. The economics of war inverted in ways planners had not modeled. The world watched trench warfare return. World War I imagery filmed with 21st-century cameras. The past at 4K resolution. AI-assisted targeting emerged on the battlefield in real time. Civilian drone innovation exploded across both military and humanitarian sectors. Cyber warfare evolved in real time. Power grids, banks, communications all became battlefields where no soldier ever physically stepped. Military planners across Earth adapted overnight. Doctrine, procurement, training, every army in the world rewrote its assumptions. But without the invasion, that transformation slows down dramatically. Armies continue preparing for older-style wars they will never fight. Drone development progresses far slower. Western defense industries remain less urgent. Procurement timelines stretch to pre-war pace. Even military spending changes. Countries across Europe dramatically increased defense budgets after 2022. Without invasion, many delay rearmament. So would the world actually be better if Russia never invaded Ukraine? It seems obvious, but history is rarely that simple. For millions of civilians? Yes, absolutely. Their answer is unambiguous, and it is the only answer that should ever matter. Lives would be saved, cities preserved, families untouched by war. The single greatest peacetime gift any timeline could offer. But history is rarely simple, because the invasion also united NATO in ways the alliance could not have manufactured alone. It exposed military weaknesses in Western inventories, accelerated energy independence, and the renewable transition by a decade or more, transformed modern warfare for every nation watching. revealed global vulnerabilities in food, fuel, and finance before they could become catastrophic. Without the invasion, the world may look more peaceful on the surface, but underneath, the same tensions remain entirely unresolved. Russia still fears NATO expansion. Ukraine still sits in geopolitical limbo between blocs. Neither problem has actually been solved. China still watches Taiwan with growing confidence. Europe still depends heavily on fragile systems it has not yet hardened. The pressure never disappears. It only waits for the next moment of opportunity, the next miscalculation, the next door left open. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. The peace we imagine here is not actually peace. It is a delay. In this alternate timeline, there's no massive war in 2022, no daily headlines, no shattered cities, no global panic. The world feels safer, more stable, more normal. The kind of normal you stop noticing because nothing forces you to. But sometimes, history's most dangerous moments aren't the explosions everyone sees. They're the disasters, quietly delayed, deferred, denied. Because if Russia never invaded Ukraine, the world may not have avoided a crisis. It may have simply postponed it. And the next time, it could be even bigger. Subscribe to Counterfact. Every week, one moment in history and the world it almost became.